Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Please take your seats for this final plenary session of the Combined Population Health Congress. And just move in, forward, come forward, don't be shy, keep rolling in. You know that there's a nice reception to follow this, so you can just hold fire there. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Shiriki Kumanyika, who is the Professor of Epidemiology in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the University of Pennsylvania. And she has many affiliations, many affiliations, a very hard-working woman, I would say, as we all are. So you can find those in your abstract book. It's an impressive list. In particular, she's the co-chair of the World Obesity Organization, which was previously the International Obesity Task Force, which reflects her particular interests and expertise. And of great note to our Public Health Association here, she's the president-elect of the American Public Health Association. So we should give her a clap on that one. Oh, yes, that's nice. You get 2 standing ovations. Now, Professor Shiriki's main focus of research is the prevention and treatment of obesity and diet-related chronic diseases. And when I say diet-related, that includes SALT, which is a particular area of interest to many researchers in this country. But also interested in improving equity in food marketing. What you don't see in your abstract book, which I found fascinating talking to Professor Kumanyika, is that her name is significant. And in seeking her cultural identity back in the 1970s, she completely threw out her old one, reclaimed a new one. And you can guess, I guess, that Shiriki means dedication or participant or a servant, serve. And who is she serving? Kumanyika. Kumanyika, the people. Now, isn't that a wonderful name? Serve the people. So thank you. On that note, I welcome you with great honour to join the podium here, and we look forward to your presentation and questions and discussion following it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction and explaining my identity, my search for roots. I'd like to begin by bringing greetings from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which is where I live, which is the home of the Liberty Bell and where the Declaration of Independence was signed, and also from the American Public Health Association, which I just was talking to some people who came last year. We're having our annual meeting in November in New Orleans. It'll be our first time there since the Katrina hurricane kept us from meeting there several years ago. I've been asked to talk about evidence, and it's one of my favorite topics. I'm going to base my comments on evidence related to obesity because that's obesity prevention is the subject that I know best. And I think it will serve the purpose very well in terms of helping us to explore some of the evidence issues that relate to a complex problem of this type. Obesity is a classic case of a wicked problem. This is a term that I like. It's contrasted with a tame problem, but it has a nice, interesting feel to it that it's wicked. Wicked problems are in contrast to tame problems where the solutions are relatively straightforward if you follow the right principles, sets of problems that are linked together, embedded in the social fabric, where there's a lot of disagreement among stakeholders with different vested interests about whether there's a problem or what the problem actually is. It's also dynamic, so when you attempt to solve wicked problems, they may change, your solution may create another problem or change the way you have to go about it. your success is always relative with things embedded in the social fabric. They're trade-offs, so you come up with a better or worse solution, not necessarily the perfect solution or the right answer. The outcomes for problems like this are determined by many things other than evidence. Even though we might have perfect evidence, if we did, there would still be the stakeholder opinions, the judgments, the political forces, and the resources, the economic issues that would define the solution. So in this case, there are going to be no best practices or simple answers. The situations are unique and they have to be tailored. And this is what we need evidence about, this messy situation. We got into this messy situation when we admitted that obesity is a population problem, not just an individual problem. We are not putting individual issues and treatment aside, but embracing the larger view of obesity as a population problem. And I'm just illustrating this here. This is the only data slide that I'll show you with the distributions of body mass index, which is our usual measure of obesity, over 20 years, a change of about 11.5 kilograms in the average weight of American adults. This kind of evidence made it clear that something was going on in society at large and that it was indeed a population problem. And when you try to draw this out, you get pictures like this. This picture was drawn in maybe 1995, 1996, as a map of the causal web of influences that affect population obesity. And it's a little overwhelming in one way, but it's actually one of the least complex diagrams of obesity causes. I spared you the Forsyte spaghetti diagram with all the circles and causal loops and some of the other ones that have been drawn, but this one has an underlying logic, and it helps us to organize the phenomena that we've actually seen happening over the past several decades, forces at the international, national level, driving change in communities and localities, and that driving change in neighborhoods, workplaces, schools, and homes to affect individuals in the aggregate so that they're in a chronic positive energy balance and gaining weight or maintaining excess weight. And these factors, globalization, development, globalization of media, advertising happening across countries, across borders, hard to regulate, and then all the other sectors, transport, Social Security, health is there, but health is traveling with a lot of other influences that may have more of an impact on the problem through the environment and maybe more resources to be leveraged to address the problem. So there are many places to intervene, but one of the points of this map is that no matter where you intervene, you're going to be connected to a lot of other pathways, and they may influence your success with your intervention, and yours may influence what's going on in those pathways. So this is what we need evidence about, not a simple story. The solution then requires a paradigm expansion from individual type solutions to public health solutions. So obesity prevention requires changes in the way we live, work, and play. And I have that in quotation marks because that's the kind of politically neutral way of saying it. It doesn't say we need a revolution, the big social transformation to turn things upside down, but that's actually what we're saying. But it sounds nicer, kinder when we say we need to change the way we live, work, and play. And we need this evidence in a timely manner. They're high-stakes decisions because we're talking about not only the real world of society, but we're talking about something that we need to keep, so we need to tweak it, like food. We can't try to get rid of an industry or totally muzzle an industry. We actually have to turn that big ship around so that it is supporting healthy living and obesity prevention in particular. So policymakers and practitioners are faced with a lot of challenging questions. How do I decide what to do? How do we know what works? What program should I fund? How do I implement sound programs? What will it cost? There's always underneath there, will this help me get reelected? And that's actually not a joke because a lot of policies may be passed because it sounds good or something that the public seem to want with or without evidence, and then we have to scramble to see whether this actually works and how to support it or get rid of it in case it's a bad idea. There's resistance to things that we need to do for obesity prevention from both supporters and opponents. You hear things like obesity prevention programs don't work. That could come from epidemiologists. That could come from researchers who look at the data, put a very strict filter on it, and say, that doesn't work, so we shouldn't do that. There's no evidence to justify such a policy, and in many cases, there can't be evidence because the policy's never been put into place anywhere. This hasn't been shown effective in a randomized trial. Comes up about things like advertising. A reporter asked me once, well, how could I think advertising was a problem if there hadn't been a trial? And I said, why don't you do a trial of shutting off communications media for a year? Let's see if the children get thinner. I mean, it's ridiculous. So you can't do a randomized trial about some things. And this last one is something that someone said to me after what I considered a stellar presentation by Sir Michael Marmot about social determinants. And the person said to me, that is the most unscientific thing I've ever heard. Because, of course, there are many different types of science. And that was a stellar social science presentation. But it didn't fit that particular observer's definition of science, and it just seemed like a lot of opinions thrown together. So the Institute of Medicine, which is part of our National Academy of Sciences in the US and an independent body that advises the government, had been looking at these evidence issues for some time in reports originally released as early as 2004 through the present. And in that first report, some work that we were doing in the International Obesity Task Force was cited, later published in a paper led by Boyd Swinburne, about the need to expand the evidence paradigm and look at different types of evidence. That was in 2005, and that did not, we didn't have any advice about how to do that. We just said there's something wrong with this evidence picture. We don't have enough, we have the wrong evidence. The people who generate evidence don't seem to know how to get their arms around the type of problem that we have. And it came up again and again in the food marketing report where they were trying to link food advertising to children's weight gain, in a report on evaluating progress in obesity prevention, again, looking at the models that were being used, and it didn't quite fit taking a broad policy and trying to use 6-month change in body mass index in a child to evaluate a broad policy way upstream. And in 2009, a report issued with a little bit of a leap of faith, but just saying to local governments, these are some things you can do to address childhood obesity outside of school times. So there was a sense that we needed to take a look at evidence and see how we could systematically approach some of these issues. So I had the privilege of leading a committee that was given the task of developing a framework for evidence-informed decision-making in obesity prevention, focused on approaches for assessing policy and community-level intervention, so not individual treatment, but environmental and policy change in the obesity prevention domain. And the main audiences would be decision-makers and intermediaries, as well as people who generate evidence, researchers and evaluators. The committee task was spelled out in great detail, as is common when sponsors, they pay for these reports. IOM doesn't have money itself to fund these reports. So we were asked to describe the current nature of the evidence base. Okay, what evidence is really out there? What were the challenges associated with integrating scientific evidence into the broader influences? The sponsors wanted a practical framework for how to select, implement, and evaluate obesity prevention efforts, identify ways that we could use existing tools or new tools and methods to build an evidence base, and develop a plan for communication, dissemination, and refinement of the framework and its recommendations. So it was meant to be a framework, a work in progress. And the reason that we needed a communication plan was because we would have to sell this both to professionals and researchers and to the public policymakers that the kind of framework we were advising would actually support making decisions and supersede other ideas they might have had about the type of evidence that would be relevant. The committee membership, it was really an exciting committee to serve on and to try to lead, actually. Some of the usual suspects here, the public health nutritionists, prevention researchers, and a pediatrician, but also people who we expected to disagree with the idea of tampering with the evidence standards, like epidemiologists. I'm one of those, but we had some others on there. The editor of a prestigious medical journal, and I was particularly glad to see him there because I had heard him say, I won't tell you which journal, although you could find that out by looking up the committee names. I heard him say from a podium, no, we wouldn't be able to ever take studies that weren't based on the evidence, the top of the evidence hierarchy. So I thought if we could bring him on board with a broader view, we had really done something, and then we also had the credibility of having him on the committee as a part of the consensus, because these are consensus reports. We also had people who are used to using different types of evidence and making good decisions based on that. Evaluation research specialists from the field of education, one of whom had written a beautiful article on evidence and so forth, and she is at Columbia Teachers College and works on evaluating natural experiments in classrooms, high stakes, because what happens to a child's life may depend on what class they get into, but needing to evaluate that without randomizing that child to a particular case. We had some of the people, and these are some of the same people, tobacco control veterans, and 3 or 4 active or past policymakers, a former mayor, 2 sitting legislators, state legislators, and another person who had been in the policy area at some time. So this was the users, the evidence generators, and then the people who knew some of the content about obesity prevention. Development of the framework we approach by answering the 2 questions that you see here. How can evidence that's currently available and potentially relevant to decisions on obesity prevention be identified, evaluated, and compiled in ways that will best inform decision makers? And the other, which is a complement, how can we generate more high quality evidence to inform decision making? So we identified 4 steps that we needed to go through based on that statement of task, and I'm going to walk through each of these steps and talk about some of the lessons that we learned. The first is identify the diverse needs for evidence, and we started this by putting up some scenarios, and I'll read through those because I'm hoping that this will become less abstract if you can envision yourself in one of these decision scenarios or advising someone in these decision scenarios. So for TV ads, there's a scenario where a federal authority is attempting to determine whether there are sufficient grounds to implement statutory restrictions on TV and internet advertising directed at children. And these are all real scenarios that have happened in the US and probably many of them here. BMI report cards. So a school board member decides whether to vote for a measure to send parents report cards of their children's BMI levels based on annual weight and height screening. Very controversial policy that has been taken up in some US school districts. Menu labeling. A local board of health or a city council considers a proposal to require that menus of chain restaurants show the calorie content of each item. The SSB tax, let me go back here. A state legislator decides whether to vote for or against a tax on SSBs. Pedestrian access. City planning authorities considering closing the city center streets to automobile to reduce traffic flow and increase pedestrian access to local businesses. So a physical activity type of policy. Park and rec centers also in physical activity area. An economically strapped city is considering cuts in funding for local parks and recreation centers. Another case where you would need evidence to support keeping that funding if that in fact would be the desired direction. Fresh food financing, very popular in the U.S. Community Development Corporation has been asked to partner in an initiative to establish a supermarket in a low-income neighborhood. Fresh food financing is now, or healthy food financing is now federal policy, but still, in a particular instance, you may need evidence for a local situation to decide whether to try to get some of that money for healthy food financing. And then finally, a state-based obesity prevention coalition is trying to identify advocacy priorities to address childhood obesity. And hopefully that would be picking these priorities not on the basis of feel good, but on the basis of something that actually has a good chance of working. So our conclusions were that we have a responsibility to generate and disseminate evidence for a lot of different reasons, and part of our goal was to see what are all the different evidence needs so that the framework would cover these different types of scenarios. So to justify action and anchor the outcomes that you would use to evaluate the action, to minimize guesswork, although there's going to be some guesswork in there, make the best use of scarce resources, justify or maintain effective policies and programs. Again, even policies you might want may get ahead of the evidence because they're passed on a political wave, and then to keep that policy in place, you have to have evidence. A tax could be passed, in Denmark, and then you lose it. Avoid or discontinue ineffective policies and programs, and that one hurts because that's that fear about evidence. If you have evidence, it might prove that your favorite project doesn't work, or may make your policymaker angry because you're telling them it doesn't work, and there are lots of precedent for that in public health and drug treatment and so forth. Avoiding harms, economic harms, not just biological, those kind of economic harms and other kind of cultural harms. Provide large-scale benefit or evidence that they can be large-scale benefit. Identifying a set of strategies that work together to address the wicked problem, and then providing guidance on the how. If you have something that works, how do you actually get it to work when you transfer it to another situation? Second step, analyze the available evidence to identify strengths and limitations. I think we knew how this was going to come out, but we went through the exercise. We used a review of reviews approach, starting about 13 years prior to this report, which was done in 2010, because that was about the time that the obesity epidemic was being recognized, and people were trying to find solutions in earnest. In the childhood obesity epidemic, the adult in the U.S. was a little bit earlier, but they thought this would be a long enough time to see, okay, what evidence base do we have? And so we had all kinds of reviews, the meta-analyses and systematic reviews, but we also used other types of evidence syntheses, best practice summaries, and task force recommendations to get a sense of what people were pulling in as evidence, how they were evaluating it, and what they were coming out with. And if you've done these systematic reviews or read them, you know that you can get up into the thousands very quickly about things that might have come up under obesity prevention. So some of the reviews had identified 12 articles, but some had identified 13,000, in the thousands of articles. But the number of eligible studies in the most inclusive review was only 158. So there really wasn't much evidence out there, and there was considerable overlap. So some of the reviews were really reviewing the same studies, maybe from different perspectives, but the same studies would keep popping up. Our conclusions about the evidence base were, again, as expected, because we thought there was an evidence gap. And it was that the evidence base was inadequate in several respects. There was insufficient evidence of effectiveness for many things, but because you kept hearing this repetitious sense that there's not enough evidence, people interpret that there's evidence that it doesn't work because you can't really put any evidence forward. There was not much of a framework for looking at evidence, for selecting evidence. People, different authors selected different studies based on their own idea of what should be included in obesity prevention. There was a focus on randomized controlled trials and on on single interventions, sort of narrow focus questions, researcher-oriented questions, not decision-maker-oriented questions. And there was really an absence of details. We can blame journal editors for this, take your intervention and your results and put it all in less than 3,000 words, or 3,500 words, and there's not much room to tell how you did this, and maybe that wasn't even studied, how you would really implement this in other scenarios. So the lessons we took away at this stage, research questions should be user-oriented, should really go back to that diagram with the kind of topsy-turvy questions that I put up. What are policymakers thinking about? And this really came home to me when I was on a committee and we invited legislative staffers in to talk with us about obesity prevention years back, and we couldn't answer any of their questions. I said, I'm supposed to be some kind of an expert. They asked like very, reasonable questions, but we had never thought about studying that. We're studying based on our ideas of what's important to study, but not how it could be used to actually solve a problem. So we thought we needed just a typology of questions, building on evidence-based public health, and that we needed external validity, meaning we could have rigorous studies, but if they were so rigorous that they gave you a perfect answer to a question that nobody cared about, that wasn't really good. So we couldn't sacrifice relevance for rigor. We needed a different type of evidence standard, a broader pathway, not a double standard in the sense of less good, but different. And we needed the systems perspective. So the third step was then to say, okay, what can we do? What are the ways that we could go about this? And we did find quite a bit of writing on evidence-based public health, really elegant writing, some of it coming from Australia and New Zealand, from Canada, but it was dominated by the literature on evidence-based medicine. So part of what we were doing here was to lift up the way that people had begun to articulate the differences between medicine and treatment-oriented strategies and public health-oriented strategies. So we took the questions, which in one source were called type 1, type 2, and type 3 questions, but we thought that would be confused with type 1 and type 2 error. So we used why questions, what questions, and how questions as the way of characterizing the types of questions for which you would need evidence. And I'll walk through these. So for why questions, we would get evidence about the health burden, about social or environmental determinants, about health disparities or inequalities, and about health care costs. And I think that we are pretty good at gathering this type of evidence. These are the stats about how many people are affected, or where the pockets of poverty are that are leading, in this case, to not having a supermarket, which groups have differences in their health statistics, and how much money we're spending on the problem. But why questions are a part of the picture. The one where we really get into trouble trying to get answers are the what questions about what should we do. And I think our contribution here was to talk about the need for intervention logic models. Many of the interventions or policies being tried could work in several different ways. Menu labeling is one that's come up in some of the discussions here. So menu labeling could work directly by people seeing, or food package labeling, by seeing something on there they don't want and putting that aside and buying something else. It could work through reformulation. It could work by getting people to stop buying that product at all. Or in the case of restaurants, it could keep people out of the restaurant, like a fast food restaurant. Or it could allow people who were worried about the calories to go into the restaurant, because then they could pick and choose from the menu items. So there are a lot of different ways, and menu labeling is a good example because it was passed not because there was evidence to support it. In fact, a very distinguished statistician argued against it on the record, even though he was in the Obesity Society in a leadership role. It was passed because somebody decided in New York City that Well, people have a right to know what's in their food. So we have a principle. We don't need evidence. But then the rush of studies to show whether or not this worked were finding null results. It doesn't work here, it doesn't work there. For African American teenage males, it worked in the opposite direction. Hey, I can get more, more calories for my money. So it points out that the thinking through that logic, what are we doing and how do we think it's going to work, is critical if you're going to evaluate it, and you have to consider those alternative pathways in your evaluation. So we want to know what the causal pathways are, what are the links between the way you deliver the intervention and specific outcomes, and what are all those unintended or unexpected consequences. And I think we should include there the behavior of the opposition to whatever strategy we come up with, because we haven't been doing as well on anticipating consequences of our advocacy in one direction with evidence that rebut some of the other things that are said about the strategy. How questions. This is really the big desert, I think, in evidence. We just haven't prioritized reporting on implementation. There are now new books on implementation science and so forth, but we're catching up with that late. So this is the external validity, the transferability, the acceptability, the stakeholder opinions, community level stakeholders, other stakeholders, the cost benefit, the priorities, and the types of challenges. So if I try to do this, hey, I like that idea. So you had all your evidence, it was about why, and then you had suggested intervention, and you had an hour, and in the first minute the policymaker said, I like it, so how do I do it? And you've got 59 minutes where you may not have anything to say if you don't have implementation evidence. We tried to be really inclusive about types of evidence, and this had come up before back in the article from the IOTF and had been said in other papers, but we tried to actually convince each other on the committee and the public subsequently that there are lots of different ways of knowing. We know that there are lots of different ways of knowing and producing information. But because we're coming as an arm of biomedicine, we are not aware, we're not educated about these other ways of knowing and their strengths and limitations and their standards of quality. And some people have been surprised to find out that there is a quality standard, for example, for qualitative research. They thought there was just a bunch of stories. And there are stories. I'm not talking about anecdotes that are very useful in swaying policymakers, but qualitative research that you can design, where there are standards for analysis and standards for interpretation, should not be evaluated with standards for a randomized clinical trial. I know that goes without saying, but we had to educate each other about how do economists generate evidence. And they really get away without trials. And they can be wrong, and they still are very high on the list of evidence generators. The education colleagues were able to be very helpful to us in talking about this. So expert knowledge comes in, community experts. We included advice on systematic ways to gather expert knowledge, so you don't just ask the person sitting next to you, but using Delphi processes and things. And we know all of this, but we tried to put it in one place and say there's no hierarchy here. We want to use these in their place, triangulate, use them in complementary fashion, and especially mixed methods where we're doing qualitative, quantitative mixed methods so that you can understand the stories that go with some of the numbers. We didn't cover public health economics in much detail, but in a subsequent article we referred to the CDC Public Health Economics Group and some of the tools that they've done. And the one area I want to point out that we didn't address at all, but is very important and should be added as this framework develops, is legal policy analysis. There are many people now who are really well schooled in doing this, coming over from political science, and I think that policy analysis to make sure that the policies that are even put in place could work is going to be critical, and it's not something that you can necessarily try at home if you haven't had some training in it. So this is what we came up with. This is the framework. It is called LEAD for Locate, Evaluate, Assemble, Evidence, and Inform Decisions. It's not a decision-making algorithm. It won't make the decision. It's a way of organizing and using evidence and enhancing the process so that you get the kind of information that's relevant, matching the question. If it's a why question, you look for why evidence. If it's a what question, you look for evidence of some sort of an intervention or a natural experiment to see if it worked. And if it's a how question, you're looking for information about implementation issues and cost and acceptability and transferability. So this is not a linear framework, and it doesn't have to be a package deal. The principles underlying specifying questions, locating evidence, evaluating evidence, within its type of evidence, and assembling are can be independently used in any type of exercise, or you may be at a stage where you really already have your evidence and you want to assemble it and may want to follow the guidelines in terms of transparency and complementarity in terms of putting the evidence together. This framework is surrounded by a reminder about a systems perspective and a reminder about the opportunities to generate evidence at every step. We included some chapter about systems thinking, not saying that everyone had to do system science, but we did include this obesity systems map just to give people an idea of the connectedness of things and a reminder that looking at single interventions would probably could easily lead to the wrong conclusion. We had guidance, a template for reporting information. If you have a chance to tell the whole story from beginning to end of why, what, and how you would put that together. And the key here is transparency, transparency, transparency. If you say what you did, then people could trace it back just like in any other evidence process, even though you may be using newspaper articles for some things and academic journal articles for other things. Just say what you did and how you used the evidence and why. We also have guidance there for how you incorporate local wisdom theory when inevitably you don't have enough evidence, for the perfect story, and how you can use this to inform the decision-making process. For opportunities to generate evidence, we were emphasizing practice-based evidence. If the experiment or the situation takes place in the real world, putting some boundaries around that and firming up implementation so that you can actually find the beginning and the end, you solve one problem of external validity right there because you've done it in the real world. Even still, it might not transfer to other situations, but that there's a wealth of evidence that could be generated. It's not prestigious evidence. It's not the Nobel Prize type of evidence. It may not feed the ego of a researcher, but if the goal is to inform policymakers, it will have a lot of validity and traction because it's happened somewhere. So our lessons from the second phase of putting it together, I think we might have thought we could take some shortcuts in the beginning because we were going to really get to the, be goal-oriented, but it turns out that this could be a time-consuming process that should be done by professionals who know their way around information sources. It wasn't a shortcut, but a wider path to looking for information. We thought that we should develop a comfort level with the uncertainties of evidence related to complex situations. There is such a temptation to control for reality. It makes it easier to study, but darn it, reality comes back. It's there. It never left. And so we have to get used to that. We can't control everything. Understand, utilize, value and triangulate evidence from the diverse ways of knowing, drawing on the best science in a lot of different disciplines, generate evidence from practice, and be transparent. So I'm summarizing by mentioning what I think are some of the key contributions of this framework and what I think the implications are. Nothing in here is new, and nothing in here in this report violates the standards of evidence, the desire, the need for validity and reliability. But we highlighted the key tenets of evidence-based public health, putting it all together in one place because it's been we're continuing to rediscover the fact that, hey, there is another way. We don't have to use evidence-based medicine hierarchies, but putting it all in one place and publicizing it so that people could find it and then use it as a proactive way of building an evidence base rather than being on the defensive for not having what people were thinking you should have because they're looking at treatment issues. We included a very clear rationale for the importance of using evidence. We gave a comprehensive look at what can be done in a different way for using the evidence, and an unapologetic definition or justification for why doing things differently is both valid and necessary. We have a whole appendix on alternate study designs in this report showing how you can get to a reasonable conclusion without having to use a randomized trial, for example. Not to say that when you can use them, they could be good if they're designed properly, but we can't always do that. It describes the how of actually applying this different approach and provides links to existing evidence resources of many types, and it is applicable to other complex health problems. We have case studies throughout the report and have encouraged people to use this and give us other case studies in practice. Some of the case studies, in one of the papers we published subsequently, and I can provide references with if we circulate the PDF of these slides, thinking through the mechanisms, the why, what, and how questions on sugar-sweetened beverage tax. Vivica Craig has done 2 papers using the LEAD framework approach to gathering and interpreting evidence on whether or not the industry and government have been following the recommendations made in prior IOM reports about marketing to children and about schools and other interventions. There's one example that we published in Public Health Reports about in preventing chronic diseases, about generating evidence by evaluating a community-based after-school program, and one from a master's student just wanted to try it, and she was very interested in sit-stand desks. And there was actually a situation in Philadelphia where someone was considering offering sit-stand desks, and so she used this framework to make a case statement, make a report about sit-stand desks in an employer situation. Implications, I hope I've convinced you that we can't do what feels right or is politically expedient and just throw the evidence out the window because it's too hard or too complicated. We also can't have the paralysis of the analysis and spin our wheels because we don't have perfect evidence about what we want. We're trying to find the sweet spot of using the best available evidence to answer the most policy relevant questions, and we have an obligation to do that while also creating some additional evidence. And for my final slide, I drew a picture of what I think is happening. There are studies in the psychology literature of stress-related growth in various situations, how people who are traumatized in different ways can grow from that stress. And I don't mean to trivialize that at all, but I do think that this term that I might have made up, methodologic stress, is really what's happened here, because the message was, you evidence people are a part of the problem. We cannot act because you're telling us that data have to be collected in a certain way. That doesn't fit the problem, and so we can't go anywhere. And so I think that this stress of how do we use what we know about evidence and principles and logic to actually inform the problem forces us to think in different ways, forces us to expand our paradigm, and hopefully improves our ability to inform decisions that will improve the public's health. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for a new twist on a difficult, complex area, and I'm sure many here appreciated the fact that you went beyond just the whole issue of obesity, but that it could be applied to other complex areas. So we'll hand over to the floor. We have an opportunity to ask questions or make comments. We have 2 microphones in the 2 side corridors about halfway back. If you have any questions that you wanted to tweet, you can do that in your text to NZPHC1. You can tweet through to NZPHC 2014, as I understand, or just with received tweets. But first of all, we're going to take questions from the floor. And to his feet, we have Professor Rodney Jackson on the left. And then on the right, the next person who stands up will be the second person. So please position yourselves at the microphone so we can get some quick follow through. And please, at the same time, just raise your hand to give me a little idea as I'm looking at you how to space the time. Thank you. Rod.
Hi, my name is Rod Jackson. I'm an epidemiologist and have been quite involved in developing some of the frameworks around evidence-based medicine. And I'd just like to really congratulate you on developing this framework, which I think is so appropriate for the topic. I mean, I think often people are always scrambling around searching for frameworks to help make sense of what they're doing. And whereas I guess experienced epidemiologists don't use frameworks because we've kind of got them in our head, most people need them. And I think that a lot of things have been done with the frameworks of evidence-based medicine and the hierarchies that are appropriate for randomized controlled trials that are completely inappropriate because they've been used by people who are searching for something to help them make sense. So I'd just like to endorse and congratulate you for developing an appropriate framework for this field. I think they're really, really important, and I'm sure that people will use them a lot.
Thank you. I was worried. So I'm glad that you're supportive.
Another question? You have another comment and how it might apply to your area and field of work? Thank you.
Yes, John Eastwood from Sydney. I agree with Rod, and I was reflecting back to the Surgeon General's framework. Help me out there, somebody, on what it was called again. Which was basically a form of inference to best explanation, which is a method of evidence and causal inference, which is used a lot in the non-medical sciences, such as Newton and Darwin. They use those sorts of frameworks, and I'm of course referring to the, help me out, someone who knows, the Bradford Hill criteria, which were used so often in epidemiology as a form of inference. So I agree, we've got to use different frameworks, and evidence-based medicine has left us with a legacy that's stopping so many of our fields actually moving forward. The critical realists, for example, have moved forward with Pawson and Tilley's work and his books on realist policy making, and that gives us another way of looking at a lot of this.
Thank you. I will say that in a way it's a shame when you go outside of health altogether, because at the time that evidence-based medicine was really gaining, traction to solve some problems in clinical medicine, then we come along in public health and and start fighting. It sounds like we're fighting among ourselves, and I'm glad that we're not actually fighting among ourselves, but the need to resist being drawn into something that's inappropriate has been a real struggle, I think, for some of us who are out in the prevention end of things.
One up the back, the way, and then down the front. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Wilma Waterlander. I work at the University of Auckland. I just wanted to ask, I recently joined the Science Advice to Government meeting, which was also held here in Auckland. And we talked about things like climate change and how Nobel Prize winning science still didn't influence policy. And what they said really was, what we really don't need is more scientists talking for longer in order to change policy. So we need to be realistic about that. So what is your take on that, and how can we actually take our evidence and making that it has an impact where we need it? And is this the way to go, or do we need other things maybe?
Yeah, that's a great question. We definitely need other things. I think we need to understand that there are many different policy-making processes and decision-making processes, and that some use or misuse evidence in different ways. I don't think that that changes the need for us to gather evidence. It really presents a challenge in what we're gathering evidence about. So, for example, and this came up a little bit this morning in our master class, if we were to listen not just to what the policymakers are asking, but also anticipate the obstacles they might have, we could offer them evidence that they could have a use for because it's on target. And there's something about telling researchers that somebody else should design the question that has been hard to get enough uptake of. But if you look, I've heard an analysis, for example, of a content analysis of the type of arguments that researchers use to argue cases and the type of arguments, the counters that are coming. So one set of people, they're talking about one thing, and we're basing evidence on our analysis of the problem, and they don't match. So I think that, yeah, we should make our evidence relevant. It may not be the academic researcher trying to get a tenured position who's doing this, but it should be someone trained in research who can benefit from actually finding out about the specific questions that are being argued in the policy sphere. We can't blame people for not using the evidence if it's not relevant.
Sione.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Professor, firstly, thank you for your presentation. It resonates with me, and been looking for some guidance around frameworks to use. My question is that in the details you provided in your framework, you refer to different ways of knowing, and I wonder whether the different ways of knowing that are based on different ways of knowing and being in a community that is culturally diverse. How did you reconcile, if you did come across that, the diverse ways of knowing things and seeing things, and therefore the evidences, anecdote or whatnot, local wisdom that might have come through? And I'm interested, how did you mediate, reconcile, and move forward to some findings and conclusions and recommendations?
I think that our framework was limited to pointing out the existence of other types of information and giving examples of how you would judge its validity. So, for example, if you're going into a community to find out what people think about something, there's a way to do that so that you get legitimate information. It's stories and opinions, but you want them to be representative of that situation and validly interpreted, for example, not interpreted through the lens of the observer to distort what the person has said. So we try to point out that there's a kind of a right way to collect, stories or other types of information, that there's validity in journalistic reports if you take them as journalistic reports and realize that they're filtered as well. Would like to hope that we opened up the eyes of some people to a lot of information that could be relevant to a problem that they wouldn't have thought of. But we didn't go into each one except for pointing to it and showing that there was a quality standard.
If there are no other further questions, I would like to take the opportunity on behalf of the organisers, who would like to graciously thank you for your contributions, your wisdom and sharing of what you brought to this conference, which is very much applicable to the work of the researchers here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Full ovations, that's not bad. So that concludes the plenary session, and I'm going to just invite Michael Baker, who's done such a sterling job, to pass over the governance aspect of the Congress. And just before I do that, do you have something?
Please. Well, we can't finish there without thanking Ruth Benita as chair for today. And I think it's very fitting she's chaired today, given that the theme has been connecting with science. And as many of you will know, Ruth herself is an outstanding public health researcher and also a world leader in translating evidence into meaningful policy that's really made a huge difference. So it's been a real honour for us to have her here today chairing this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.
Thank you.
Whoa. Thank you. Thank you. What a pleasure it's been too. I've never, ever been at a conference when there's been so many standing ovations. And I'd just like to end up my last statement by inviting Julie Park. She has something very important to tell you, and it relates to our joint reception between the three organisations, the Public Health Association, the New Zealand College of Public Health Medicine and the Health Promotion Forum, and segueing into the Australasian Epidemiology Association. And you're going to tell us about the wonderful musicians who are going to perform.
Thank you, Ruth. Kia ora tātou. Julia Peters from the College of Public Health Medicine. We're about to go into our reception, and I just want to tell you a little bit before we get out there about the entertainment program that we have for you tonight. Before I do that, I just want to thank very much Lee Martelli and Lisa Chung from the Auckland Philharmonia Orchestra education program, who worked with me to put this program together. And I'm going to introduce the musicians you're going to hear in a minute, but just to say that the purpose of the APO Young Achievers program is to give young aspiring musicians the opportunity to perform in different environments. So they're very much looking forward to performing for you. If you can take your glass of wine and go and pass by them, I know that they will appreciate that. So tonight we have Sam Rich on percussion. Sam's a 19-year-old student and he's enrolled at the University of Auckland. He's currently in his second year of a Bachelor of Music degree. I heard Sam play the marimba. He couldn't get that here tonight, so he's going to be playing something else. We have Stephen Nye on the ukulele. Stephen's dream was to be a great electrical guitar player, but they only had a ukulele in the house, so that's what he had to work with. He's been playing since he was 6 years old. And he brings a whole new approach to the instrument. And at 17 years of age, this Tongan ukulele champ is ready to stand up and show the world a new era for the wooden 4-string. And I've seen Stephen in concert as well, and he's fantastic. And we also have Bradley Wood on the piano. The piano's just a little bit tucked out of direct view, so you might just have to pop round the corner to see the piano. Bradley is from Christchurch. He's 20. He's currently a third-year student at the University of Auckland, and he's working towards his Bachelor of Music degree. And all these young performers have been performing with the APO this year and around Auckland, and I think we're very fortunate to have them with us tonight. So they'll each have a 20-minute slot between 5:30 and 6:30, and then at 6:30 we have our very own Roger Marshall, our epidemiologist and biostatistician, and he's playing with his violinist John O'Looney, and they're playing folk and rock for us. And yeah, so they're sort of in the style of Bob Dylan. So they'll be on at 6:30.
Thank you very much. Right. As I'm stepping down, somebody's left his bag. No rush, but his bag.
We're into the final closing session, and those of us from the governance group have been absolutely delighted at the whole feel of the conference and the comments that are coming back from people about how this Congress is feeling like we're meeting as a family, that we have caught up with people that we have respected, mentors of our own, those that we have mentored, and that there is a real sense of being together in terms of people working in public health. So in this final closing session, as we look for some of our stray people who have disappeared all over the place that we want to thank, there are some issues around saying actually thank you to all of you, because you have made such an incredible contribution to this being a sense of, that public health is our business, and that we actually do need to work together, and that there's a sense of energy and also some passion and urgency about what we do. Before I get onto the thank yous, there is one housekeeping message for people here, that if you had papers presented, or you've got papers and abstracts in the abstract book that you want to have published in the Congress proceedings, you need to get them back to Heather Kane. Now, Heather probably has been in contact with you, but if she hasn't, please would you contact her. Heather, are you in the auditorium? No. Oh, yes. So Heather is there. Heather, do you mind just standing up so that people know who they need to nab at the end of the day? So if you can see Heather, or otherwise send the message through the email system that you've been communicating with the conference organisers. Have we got Trevor? Trevor. Okay. Now, we have got some thank yous that we would like to make. First of all, we haven't yet, I'm hoping to have a slide up shortly that notes the sponsors that we have had for the Congress. That should appear up shortly, because I wasn't actually going to read them all out. But maybe I will. I might wait till that slide comes up, because there's quite a lot of them. They're all on the front page of the this thing which you've had. Maybe I'll start from the beginning, because I really do want to acknowledge that the Auckland Regional Public Health Service, which is Auckland, Waitemata and Counties Manukau, have been a gold sponsor and delegate sponsor for us, and we really appreciate that. We've had keynote speaker sponsors of ASH, the Canterbury District Health Board, and the Master Plants sponsor and delegate sponsor from the Health Promotion Agency. There are ourselves in terms of the Public Health Association, in terms of the Being Welcome function sponsor, the Massey University, and our thanks to them, and for the awards event last night, which was a very, very well organised, thank you. That was Massey University, and Paul McDonald spoke last night. Cancer Society for the food. Delighted to have some of that. And then we've had the app sponsors, which are Heart Foundation, Pacific Heartbeat, and Tala Pacifica, and USB Stick sponsor and delegate sponsor, which was Regional Public Health. And delegate sponsors from College of Nurses Aotearoa, the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, the Australasian Faculty of Public Health Medicine, and Hawke's Bay District Health Board. Thank you very much. So a big thank you, if we could give them a big thanks for their support, because we certainly have members from those organisations present here. We also have those that had exhibitions out there. And I think one of the special things about the sponsors is that those are all parts of our members for the different organisations, and it's lovely to actually be sponsored sort of within us, within our group. I also want to thank people who have been involved in the Congress committees. I don't know how many of you are still here, but could the people that were in the program committee please stand up? I think we have a very big thank you to you people for a fabulous program here in the last couple of days. The Abstract Review Committee. Have some of those people, could you please stand if you're on that committee? All right. We have the Finance and Sponsorship Committee. which speaks volumes when it's about the smallest committee. And thank you, because in public health that's not always an easy task. So thank you very much for that. The Communications Committee. And the Declaration Working Group, please, if you would stand. And I would like to particularly acknowledge Doon has done an enormous amount of work over the last few weeks in terms of that, and has been working very hard during this Congress too to pull that together. So thank you very much, Doon. A couple of other thank yous that I'd like to make before I pass on to other people. I was going to thank Miria for her emceeing last night, but I gather she is no longer here. Is that correct? Yeah. But anyway, shall we give her a thank you? Because it was a wonderful, wonderful evening last night. There's somebody who we often forget and who has gone above her duty in terms of organising this committee, and I'd really like Rachel from Conference Organisers to come down the front, please. Now we know that we pay conference organisers to work here, but really, Rachel, you have done so much for us and gone beyond what could be expected at times. We won't tell you what she had to deal with at times, but a very big thank you for that.
Thanks, Jane. There's a few other people that we want to mention by name, and we'd like them to come up on stage as well. And they are Warren Lindbergh. Hopefully Warren's somewhere in the room. Warren, of course, is the CEO of the Public Health Association. The one that we'd like up on the stage is Sione Tuatahi, who's the CEO of the Health Promotion Forum. And lastly, Jane Dancer, who's the General Manager of the New Zealand College of Public Health Medicine. Thank you very much for all your efforts. Sorry, we've just got some gender-appropriate presents. Need to make sure we give out the right ones. And last but... Sorry? Yes, please, you're welcome to stay. Please stay. Because another person that we'd like up on the stage, last but not least, and certainly someone that I think this Congress couldn't have happened without his energy and his enthusiasm, and he's been the driving force behind the Congress. He's been a member of the steering committee. He's been the chair of the program committee. He was also on the communications committee. I think he basically stood up all the time when we were listing all the committees. And that, of course, is Michael Baker.
E te iwi tēnā koutou. He kōrero iti nei tāku e nari ka tuaku hau i te tuatahi ki te mihi atu kia koutou katoa huri noa te rūma. I tēnei wā, ka hoki atu tō mātou tiamana o te rūnanga whakapiki ake i te hauoro o Aotearoa ki tōna ake kaina. Kuira te tikana ka tuake a hau i runa tōna tūna ki te mihi i tēnei wā. Nari, ka huri aku whakaaro kia koutou rā e aku nui e ngā rangatira ara ko te rōpū kaumātua. Kua riro mai te honore, ku roto ia hau ki te tū, ki te mihi kia koutou, mo tō koutou kaha, ki te hāpai. Te kaupapa nei o tō mātou hui, ki te pūmau, tonu koutou ki ngā wairuatana, kia haere tō tika o tātou hui i ngā rangi e toru kua mahu ake nei. Nō reira, e aku nui, e aku rangatira, kai te mihi kia koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou, kia ora hui mai tātou. Tū mai koutou, ko mai rā te paki.
You have traveled the distance to come to this wonderful place they call Auckland. And as you leave the shores of Auckland to the far lands, go in peace. You came in peace, return in peace. Return to your families and be careful that you get home safely. It is not your driving or your travel, but it's those others along the road that may cause danger. Go in the love of the grace of the Holy Spirit. E ta e koutou ki o koutou kainga, koe o Amerika, koe o wiwi, koutou o wāwā, hei e ingo tangi māre, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. O tākou, murihiku, tēnei te karanga atu ki a koutou, hare mai tikina mai te taonga, e tukuna atu nei ko te Māori o tēnei hui. We are now going to give the energy of the Māori over to Otako, which is Otago, Murihiku, which is the Invercargill of South Island, the taonga that they may look after till the next conference, 2015.
Is Marion Poor? Marion Poor is here on behalf of Otago Southland.
oranga, toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi ko ngā reo te ao. Tau te reo whiti whakamaua kia tīna. Tīna. Au ne hui a. Tai ki.